think there are broadly two patterns that emerge from the experience that I often return to, and I hold inside me as these kind of fountains of happiness that I still think no one can take away from me. One of them, of course, was the experience of being out in these incredibly wide open spaces. And I'll just give you a little flavour of what that was like.
You might remember, if you're a long-time listener, Jack Weatherford joining me on the podcast 4 years ago, all the way back at the beginning on episode 19. He wrote this wonderful book called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. He tells the story of how these otherwise unsophisticated, unorganized, disparate nomadic steppe herders came to dominate the world in one lifetime. The book is full of war, history, the clash of civilizations, but what I loved most from it was of the anecdotes of constant riding and journeying to new lands these groups of tens, hundreds, or thousands of nomads would partake in, over 800 years ago, one mission at a time. Each Mongol, 10 horses to his name, charging across the steppe, traversing mountain ranges, drinking a lot of fermented horse milk and eating meat roughened beneath their saddle from a day's ride. Jack said as much himself in the interview, there is some indistinguishable magic to the steppe, days of uninterrupted, unfenced, nomadic pasture under the great blue sky. It is, after all, where horses were first domesticated, more than 6,000 years of equine evolution and passed down culture. And so, in the absence of me making it to Mongolia myself, and in pursuit of some romantic projection onto it, I sought out books on Mongolia. One stood out in particular. It stood out because it was an Australian expeditionist who had made the journey. This fella, Tim Cope, who is seated across from me now, underwent a 3-year journey traversing the entire Eurasian Steppe. He started in Karakorum, the Mongolian capital of the Khan Empire, and crossed westwards through Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Russia, Ukraine, and finally Hungary until he reached the Danube River. The journey took him 3 years to complete and 4 horses. He picked up a dog, Tigan, along the way, and his journey saw him robbed, threatened, welcomed, and exposed to murderous heat and cold. I first wrote to Tim 4 years ago, so we've maintained a very spotty correspondence in anticipation for today. We discussed his journey and each nook and cranny of a tangent that made itself available. Tim Cope is an Australian adventurer, author, filmmaker, photographer, expedition guide, a fluent Russian speaker, a bloody good writer, and someone generous enough to offer me their time and invite me into their home here in rural Victoria. This is a long one in the making. I really hope you enjoy it. And here is the interview which we just recorded.
Awesome. I think that's really good. 2005, I'd come out of 4 months of being stuck in Akbakai in this kind of post-apocalyptic landscape. I should say a town, a society, into spring on the steppe, where for my first week out of there was absolutely no one. And it's the kind of landscape where it's more akin to an ocean because it's almost featureless. The sense of texture, of feature is whatever the weather brings to that, whatever emotion you're projecting onto it. No one knew where I was except the animals and the land itself. My watch had long died. I'd learned a lesson in that town. They have a saying in Kazakh, if you must rush in life, rush slowly. I'd given up on my arbitrary deadline of reaching Hungary in 14 months. It turned out to be, of course, 3.5 years. I was only 2.5 years late. And that released me from the pressure of meeting that deadline. In addition to that, you have a horizon with 0 fences. There are no obstacles that can't be traversed. I had this feeling with my 3 horses by my side, by my dog, Tigan, released from winter, running as fast as he could. It wasn't yet summer, so he could run even without letting his tongue out to cool down. He could run like the wind. I could camp wherever I wanted to because the spring grass was starting to come back. And I just felt like this is the kind of unadulterated freedom that I may never experience again. And to this day, it's almost indescribable. This sense of, your sense of place is so difficult to put into words. No one on this planet, in a planet that's so congested, that's so connected, no one knew where I was or what I was going through. And that instilled in me a sense of freedom that I guess I'd aspired to, and which I did achieve. You know, that was one of the things that I went there looking for, and it attracted me to the steppe. That sense of being able to break away from human constructs, from the 9 to 5. And I'd earned it by then. I'd been through some struggles. But that type of experience I did have many times on the trip going forwards from there. The other pattern, of course, was to go from those big open vast spaces into the embrace of strangers that took me in at all times of the day and night, without judgment, with a hot cup of tea, with food on the table, without interrogation. And nonetheless, it's still terrifying when you turn up on someone's doorstep. You just don't know what lies on the other side of that door as it opens. You know, either going to be a person that trusts me, that I'm looking bedraggled, I haven't washed in 2 weeks, I've turned up in the night with 3 horses and a dog, I'm a single male, and time again people took me in as I was. And I think one of the other exciting prospects of this journey for me that kept that fire in my belly to help get over those many obstacles to start the trip in the first place was just the fact that for 10,000 kilometres ahead, no one knew I existed. There was zero perception until that door opened and there was someone looking back at you. And that's also very freeing, because there's without preconceptions, you do tend to take things as they are. And I think that, if anything, is one of the great privileges of being in that environment in Australian, because there was a neutrality there that didn't come with any preconception or any baggage or any distrust. So I felt that had I been a Mongolian, for example, I probably would have been treated differently. But I was able to maintain a very personal and direct relationship with all these different cultures. And look, I'm indebted to all those families that took me in, and unlike any other journey that I've done with horses, when they're hungry, when they're tired, when you need something for them, that is the driving priority of the journey. And my own needs were secondary, and if that meant staying in a little community that might have otherwise been intimidating or a little bit undesirable, people who were potentially going to steal from me, et cetera, then I just had to deal with that. I didn't have the luxury to pick and choose my friends based on my perceptions. I was constantly forced to create, to find common ground and create
and put your faith in them.
Trust and relationship with people who were extremely different from me, and who I'd only just met. And I often think that in our society, I'm guilty of this all the time. It's hard not to be when you're more independent the way we are. The first sign of distrust, it's easy to retreat back into your home, back into your shell, or back into your own little community that can sometimes become a bit of an echo chamber with in terms of views and things like that. I think what's much harder is when you depend on others who don't share your views, who don't share your life experience, and that's what this type of journey forced me to do. So I think there's some of the magic things that I'll probably never experience that level again, and which I hold tight inside me. And the book has been a commercial success in the scheme of things, but most importantly, it was a personal journey that was deeply satisfying for me, and enabled me to kind of digest it, learn from it personally, and kind of move on. Well, kind of move on. It's still my life.
So it was a beautifully written book. Did you know you could write well before this came about?
When I was in year 9, I wrote a piece about actually going into a coma or coming out of a coma based on my real experience. When I was about 10 years of age, I somehow managed to get Japanese encephalitis and was eventually ended up in Monash Medical Centre in Melbourne. And when I did come out of my coma, I had no memory for the first few days. So I didn't recognise my parents.
Oh my God.
I had a lot of hallucinations, which I can still remember vividly to this day.
Yeah.
And I wrote a very descriptive piece for an English project in Year 9, and my teacher said to me, you could be a writer. And I knew I loved writing then, probably even earlier, but from that point onwards, I realised that writing was first and foremost for me a way of processing things, a way of learning from experiences I'd had in my life. So, I'd been told that I could write, and I loved writing, and my dream was to be an author, long before I became an adventurer or had that inkling. I think once I go into that deep state of writing, which I'm sure most writers experience when you get into that flow state, tapping into something that's much deeper, and somehow you can tie things together that kind of they transcend chronology and time, and there's always that beautiful symphony that bubbles up between the aesthetics of the writing, the emotions, the hard realities. I really love that element of writing, and finding a way to communicate that is, to me, it's an art, and very fulfilling. Yeah.
So when you come out of a coma and you don't remember anyone, can you recall sort of how scary and bewildering all that was?
I don't remember it being scary at all, but eventually I remember looking up at Mum, and something kind of twigged. I thought, "Oh, I know you," and so it was like I'd been clean reset.
Right.
Factory
reset.
So it was everything started to come back in one by one, and eventually, of course, I remembered everything.
Right.
But it was quite an amazing experience to kind of start with a clean slate.
Yeah.
And,
And on the trail of Genghis Khan wasn't the first book you'd written. You'd done a book about this cycling journey across Mongolia beforehand.
Yeah, when I was if I may, I might go into a bit more of a backstory.
Sure.
When I was 18, I took a year away from between school and uni. Travelled in Eastern Europe and Europe itself. Worked in Britain. Came home to study law, and I just wanted to be out of there. I found a way out, which was to study as a wilderness guide in Finland. By that stage, I had spent during that year overseas some time in Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Sarajevo, Belgrade. It was 1997, so not long after the war, and I had just this incredible sense of fascination of the East. So Finland kind of was very close to Russia. Wild north, it was my dream. So I ended up there, studied for a year as a wilderness guide, and eventually at the end of that I had this opportunity to either go back and restart my studies in Australia or commit to making an adventure out of life in a different way. And the letter that the university sent me was something like, if you do not re-enroll, we'll consider that you have decided to pull out. And so I thought, well, I can't live out these dreams of travelling and meeting these people and places on weekends. It has to be it's all or nothing. So I I surrendered my return ticket to Australia. My friend in Australia, who I'd met briefly at uni, he wanted to ride. He was a cyclist, and together we hatched the idea of cycling across Russia to China.
Mm-hmm.
This is 1999, and so we did it. And at the end of that journey, our dream had been to write a book. I soon went back to Russia after that journey to join 3 others on a rowboat trip through Siberia, and I was doing regular call-ins to ABC. Fortunately, I think it was Radio National that a publisher at Penguin was listening in that morning on her way to work, and via the ABC found me and said, "You've got a great way of describing your journey. Would you like to write a book about it?"
Oh, mate, what a dream.
And so I said, I'd love to, but I've got this other journey, the cycling journey. And so we ended up writing, I wrote my first book together with Chris, who had done the cycling trip. So we did it in alternating chapters.
The serendipity of having a publisher approach you.
Yes.
As I'm sure you know, having published many other books later, you know, like the opposite slog of having written it, getting an agent, trying to find a publisher interest. That's incredible.
It was incredibly. It was just serendipity. Yeah,
do you chalk it up to serendipity though, or did you, like, obviously the humble answer is it's serendipity, but also it is something rather extraordinary, a story that you have to tell, being only, 21, 22 at the time?
Yeah, I was 21, and look, before starting our journey, I had approached Untold Publishers, I approached magazines.
Right.
And I just got rejection after rejection after rejection. We ended up, it was the early days of blogging, but we had a website where we updated stories regularly. So it was quite an amazing experience for it to come to me after all of that. And one thing that's stuck with me, I mean, even for the later book, Trail of Genghis Khan, I did in the end have an offer for a contract for a book before I started the trip, but I decided not to sign. I remember taking it with me in the car with my parents to the airport in Melbourne before flying to Mongolia, but it didn't feel right. I didn't know what the story was going to be yet. Yeah. There were so many unknowns. I felt like I don't want to be tied into some preconceived idea of a book, and so.
And it ended up being years longer than you had anticipated as well.
Yes, which would have made the publisher tear their hair out anyway.
Yeah,
so,
and then you'd have this external pressure of an obligation you need to fulfill.
And I wanted the journey to be as authentic as it was. I didn't want this sense. So it was serendipity, but one of those things that I tried to force my way, break my way into being an author. To the point that several writer friends of mine, they'd said, "Look, you don't have to wait for someone else to give you the title of writer. You are a writer. You write.
Right.
Don't worry about it. Just do your thing."
Yeah.
And that's eventually what I had to do, and it all kind of.
And was it in Finland you started learning Russian? Okay. Why'd you decide Russian, not Finnish? Russia had more applications.
In Finland,
Finnish is just impossible.
Finland is a very interesting language, and I became very, very interested in the Finnish culture. But Russian would have a lot more usage. And at that time, I was 19. As much as I loved Finland, it was more of a clinical environment. Everything runs on time. Everything's smooth and. Life is compartmentalised as it is in many parts of the West. Whilst next door in Russia, where we did some of our course, the moment you cross that border, I mean, it was
the Wild West.
It was the type of chaos that I just drank in and loved. In the midst of that chaos, this is the late 90s, they were just going through that issues in 1998 where the currency basically just had massive inflation. Teachers hadn't been paid for weeks and months on end. People were going back to growing food in their dutches. literally fishing and hunting to put food on the table. And there was a sense of solidarity in the midst of those difficult times, a sense of life and happiness and hospitality that couldn't be found in that much more kind of austere environment of Finland. So the first time I went to Russia, I've got to learn Russian. As we talked before the interview, the environment is identical, but cultures that are at loggerheads with one another. On the course that I studied, we had Russians and Finns, and Finns have this very moral sense of independence, and that you should never really expect or ask for help unless you've really tried to do it by yourself. Whilst the Russians are very much of more of that collective thinking, where it's very rude not to offer help,
right,
without asking, or even to help without a request. And so we often found ourselves in conflict on that course. And I, as an Australian, I was interested in both of these ways of doing things, but ultimately spent more time in Russia than I did in Finland.
Yeah. All right. So the reason why I wrote to you 4 years ago, this incredible book on the trail of Genghis Khan. I love how you were 24 when you went, but it was the first time you'd ridden a horse was only something like 6 months before you left, something like that. And so could you just take us through from your time with this person in Australia who taught you a little bit about horsecraft to then you being in Mongolia and no one wanted to sell a white man a horse because they were under the impression that this guy's just going to have them stolen on the first night. This is not a good use of our horses.
Yeah. I was actually first on a horse when I was about 7, but it was a very brief encounter. My dad put me on a horse that he'd brought home to where I grew up in Gippsland, put my brother behind me on the horse. Our little Jack Russell came running out. The horse reared up. I went down. We both went down. I think my brother's face ended up in the dirt, but I broke my arm, and I was off to hospital, and that was me and horses. Yeah. And I never thought I'd get back on, to be honest. But seeing horses and Mongolian on this animal that's evolved as indigenous to that environment over millions of years, gave me a completely different perspective of horses. And I thought the only way to truly discover the steppe culture and the history and to transcend the modern era would be to jump on a horse myself. So when I came back, I did a lot of research, but it was actually where we're staying, where I live right now. I was up the mountain here, Mount Bogong, where I had my first ride. I actually joined a 5-day pack horse trip. I then spent 3 days with a horse vet and some trainers in Western Australia, in Margaret River, and that was it. Months and months of researching and connecting with people who were so-called long riders, so people who'd done journeys of more than 1,000 miles on horses with pack horses. So, but I was forever just relying on the fact that this reassuring concept that I would be riding amongst the original horse people of history, and that if I was to learn anything about horsemanship, who better than to learn from them? So I had a few basic principles, but when I first arrived in Mongolia, quite rightly, the locals were very, very reluctant to sell me a horse. In fact, to buy my first horse, I enlisted the help of a Mongolian friend who, on an election day when there were lots of nomads coming in from various points, he purported to be buying some horses for himself, only to reveal to the buyers later that it was for me. I was kind of hiding at that point in the girth. They were a little bit horrified.
Just in the passenger seat of the car.
Well, in one of the families, nomad gers and a yurt. And so they didn't have a lot of faith in me, and for good reason. And look, the first day of the trip, I walked out of town from Hatterhorn, the old capital of the Mongol Empire. I was too afraid to actually get on the horse. And there was a number of Mongolians who'd gathered to see this person, apparently, who was about to follow in the footsteps of their great godlike leader, Genghis Khan. So it would have been a fairly unimpressive sight to see me walking out of town with 3 horses. But look, I don't speak good Mongolian even to this day. But being on a horse in Mongolia, by the time I reached my first camp, I mean, people would have eyed me off for hours through their monoculars. Right. They would have already guessed my age. They would have figured out what state my horses were in, what I needed. The tea was ready. They knew where the horses were going to graze. The horses themselves became my key to that culture and landscape. So whilst it was terrifying and took about 6 months before I could wake up in the morning and not feel overwhelmed by the fear of dealing with these animals.
That's a long time to feel constantly anxious about, are my horses okay? Are they going to be stolen? Are they going to be attacked by wolves? Will they respond to my commands? Are they being fed? Are they healthy?
Yeah.
That's taxing.
I mean, horsemanship is it's a craft where you never stop learning, and I was as green as you can get, more or less. But I think what I had completely underestimated was just how tied I'd be to them and to the land. That was it. That was the vice. Really, it was on one hand, that was the reason I was there. I was there to be tied to the land in a way I hadn't been before. I was relying on. They were relying on me, on finding grass, shelter, water each and every day. It wasn't like trekking through the environment or riding a bike where you could choose a hill with a nice view. There had to be enough grass, and they would need at least 20 to 30 litres each per day. And that's not something you could map out in advance. That's just something that you need to learn. And so I learned it from scratch. So all those different things. And obviously trying to pack an animal and not get kicked and bitten and all the other things that can
Which
go
you
wrong.
were all of the above at some stage.
Yeah, little by little. But I was very conservative in the early times. And I don't think I had my first gallop until about a year into the trip or something like that. In part to conserve the animals, but in part to conserve my own well-being.
And it was on your sixth night they were stolen.
Yeah, day 5. So I set off with 3 horses, 2 pack horses, and an animal. And at that time, I was actually with my then girlfriend, Catherine, who was from Germany.
The German.
And woke up in the middle of the night. I'd gone to sleep thinking, this is utopia, this oceanic space of green grass, people bringing their horses, animals back in to feed. But 3 a.m, that had all gone. Windy, dark, and I could just hear in the distance my horses galloping off. I thought, surely they haven't been stolen, but of course the only thing remaining out there was a bell that a vet in Australia had said I should put on the horses at night to protect them from thievery. I had 1 horse of the 3 remaining, and armed with this saying that in Mongolia, if you don't solve your problems before the sun comes up, you never will. I headed off, and a few hours later, as the sun rose, there were this herd of horses, and there were my horses kind of hanging on the back of that herd. Their halters were gone, everything was gone, but didn't matter. There was a nomad nearby, gave them back to me, took me to his home, actually made me a couple of halters, and through the help of some translation via satellite phone, told me this proverb that a person on the steppe without friends is as narrow as a finger, and with friends as wide as the steppe.
Nice.
So it was a real wake up call for me. That
Didn't you suspect that he was the one who stole them? Does it almost teach you a lesson?
Could have been him.
Like a very cheeky joke.
I learned with time that there's a very fine line between friend and foe, and yes, could have well been. We did have.
You speculate in the book that it
yes.
was him.
Well, see, when the guy who I bought one of my original horses from, he rode with me for the first few days, and they always say that the person who's most likely to steal a horse is the original owner.
Okay.
You have to get as far away as you can. And he had warned me many times about horse stealing and to look out for it, to avoid it. I'd kind of dismissed it. So, yeah, there was that speculation that it could have been him who'd stolen it, or it could have been the guy, obviously, who gave them back to me. Because he said, I knew they were yours, you must have tied them really badly. Yeah. But I'll never know. But yeah, with time I learnt that really it's your responsibility to look after your horses. And if you don't create a connection with the local people, then you're kind of fair game anyway.
Yeah. And you got the bell idea from the Australian.
Yes,
but it turns out maybe that the bell attracted the thievery in the night.
Potentially.
Did you end up removing bells from the horses?
No, I ended up using it not so much for thieves in the end though, but just so that what I ended up doing was I'd tether 2 horses at night, and the third one I would leave to roam, so that they could eat grass as they freely, and I'd try to rotate those roles each night, and the bell would always be on that one roaming horse. Okay. They were very unlikely to go too far because we created our own little herd, but it was reassuring to wake up in the night and hear a bell softly dinging in the distance. I knew that the horse was still there.
Yeah, totally.
And it was the times when it was dead silent that I would poke my head out of the tent. Yeah. And I'd skip a beat until I saw the silhouette of the horse in the dark and having a sleep or rest.
And so the title of the book is On the Trail of Genghis Khan, and you go from the old Karakorum Mongol Khan capital in the middle of Mongolia, right?
Central Mongolia.
To the Danube River in Hungary.
Yeah.
So that geographical region, the Eurasian Steppe, talk about why it is a geographical region, like what are its qualities that make it so, and what countries, modern day borders it covers.
So when Genghis Khan proclaimed himself the leader of the Mongol Empire, this is very early on.
Leader of those who sleep in felt tents.
Exactly.
Or something like that.
He proclaimed himself the leader of all those who live in felt tents. Yeah. And by that, he was kind of ordaining himself as the leader of all of the steppe nomadic cultures that range from Mongolia all the way to the Danube. It's the so-called Eurasian Steppe. Now, the Mongols were just one of many, many steppe empires that goes back to the first era of horse domestication, roughly 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. So the Eurasian Steppe is an environment that is indigenous to the it's the native environment of the horse, the wild horse, and obviously domesticated horse, and it these days includes part of Mongolia, or all of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, the various Kazakh tribes, the southern republics of Russia. So people like the Kalmyks, who are the only Buddhist people, or the only Buddhist republic in geographical Europe.
Cool.
There's a long story about them, but the Kalmyks were a part of the Oirat Mongols, the Western Mongols, who had their own empire. Then you've got the steppe of the Kuban, that's kind of the natural home of the Cossacks, who evolved on the borderlands of the Russian frontier. And you've got the Crimean Tatars in what was Ukraine and still is. Then you have people like the Hutsuls of the Carpathians, who actually are still semi-nomadic and have horses that are descendants of horses that the Mongols left behind in Europe when they retreated. And then you've got the Hungarians, the Magyars, whose ancestors were the Magyars, who came out of Europe in about the 10th century, conquered the Carpathian Basin and founded Magyarország, modern-day Hungary. All of these people and this environment is connected by a horseback nomadic way of life. And symbolically, Genghis Khan, he proclaimed himself leader from the Orkhon Valley. And there was this belief in Mongolia that he who rules from the Orkhon Valley becomes a kind of omnipotent leader, a sacred...
Because it's the most steppe part of the steppe?
It's a sacred valley. Geographically, it's very strategic. It's right in the centre where you have that meeting point of those very arid environments of the steppe, so bordering southwards towards the Gobi Desert. Northwards you have the kind of prairie steppe that you might imagine, that typical open, green, undulating landscape that just disappears into the never-never. But it's also close to what is sometimes called the forest steppe, so that region where the boreal forests of Russia and Siberia mingle with those open plains. And nomadic people, nomadic horseback cultures, have always occupied that zone, stretching from the boreal forests deep into the Gobi Desert. And and the Orkhon's right in the centre of all of that. And previously there'd been several empires that had based their capital there as well. So it become an omen for that most Mongolian people, at least, thought to be a sign that this is a leader sent to us from the heavens.
Right. And the one part of the book, one of the sort of sub-narratives is just tracking the decline of nomadic culture throughout these various countries, because for 5,000-6,000 years it sort of looked exactly the same until industrialization, whereas now, if I remember correctly, all throughout there was always signs of the nomadic route, but Mongolia and the eastern part of Hungary were maybe the only two places that were still really suitable, where you could comfortably roll into a place and there would be places for your horses. People would understand instinctively why you were doing it and treat you as a nomadic traveller. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, look, I think one of the original kind of basic concepts that intrigued me and kept me awake many a night was, as I read more about the Mongolians, here we have the largest contiguous land empire that's ever been, ruled by a nomad who lived and died on his horse in a felt tent. And that's, for most Westerners like myself and what I learned growing up, it's incongruous with the concept of emperors. Also,
he supposedly never stepped foot into any of his conquered cities.
Yeah.
Whether we know that, whether that's true or not, but it's like adds to that mythology.
Yes, no. They had a very different approach to a lot of other empire or a lot of other conquest-based empire making. I just thought, well, that's really symbolic of how little we know about and how much we underestimate nomadic cultures and cultures other than our own. And I think it's always a red flag when there's a culture that's being demonised, as the Mongols had been for so long, until the 1970s onwards, when historians started to take a slightly different look at the Mongols and start to rebrand them, if you like, historically. I think that if you look at the early stories, the Mongols were judged through the prism of Christianity. They were judged through the prism of those who were defeated.
They became a caricature of, or the defining caricature of the savage, of the totally uncivilized person. And Jack Weatherford, in his book, traces it back to a play Voltaire did when he couldn't openly disparage the royalty at the time, so cast them as Mongolian.
Yes.
And that negative association sort of lives down, and to the point where in the United Kingdom, where people who were born mentally handicapped were officially deemed Mongol.
Yes.
Like it's a Mongol. And then that comes out of that as Mongoloid. And then it's like all these things that start seeping into our historical memory of these people. Yeah. And there's still an open question. It's like, a book's found on a Chinese library called The Secret History of the Mongols, which informs a lot of their, the glorious part of their history and so forth. But yes, sorry.
No, that's fine. Yeah. I mean, I just, what I really wanted to do was understand, explore, immerse myself in this culture, and return to Western society looking at the world through their eyes. Because I think that there has been a historical conflict between nomadic cultures, sedentary cultures, that goes back, because both of those cultures kind of evolved in parallel in different environments. One is not superior or inferior than the other, but the narrative of the West is often that they're superior. The nomads were the savage barbarians who were uncivilized, who came in from the East. And if you look at the early days, of course, those who had never seen horses before, their first encounter, if you read Herodotus, and were these so-called centaurs, these kind of man-horse beasts that would come out of that great Never Land, bent on destruction. So their first encounters with horses was a very negative one. But as the Western world and the Arab world and Central Asia, Southern Asia adopted the horse became increasingly a symbol of power and good. But the kind of perspective of nomadic people remained very much imbued with a negative experience. And most of our narrative of the nomads has been written by those who were defeated, and that's never going to be a positive.
No, exactly.
A positive narrative. So, look, I wasn't interested in following the footsteps of soldiers or conquerors. I liked that one single idea, that I wanted to explore the scale and breadth of this incredible place and the diverse cultures that are all tied together by that thread of nomadic life. And I wanted to kind of push back and give people, through my writing and so forth, a personal insight into cultures that are a little bit of a blind spot in our geographical knowledge and our historical knowledge. Certainly was in my upbringing. I don't think I ever learned anything about Central Asia or Mongolia. And I wanted to go to the Danube River, partly, of course, because that was roughly one of the extents of the Mongol Empire, but more importantly, it's where the geographical steppe peters out into the temperate climes of Europe, and so that's where historically it's the end of the nomad world, and so it was naturally going to be the finish for me.
So you're crossing Mongolia. It took you several months.
Yes.
And you're with your German girlfriend at the time.
Yep.
And she leaves at one stage. Her story unfolds.
Yes.
She gets sick.
Yep.
You break up.
Yep. Yeah.
But you then enter into Kazakhstan, and this is when things start to get a little bit... Like it turns from...
The honeymoon and the trip was over.
Right, exactly. Like the idyllic rolling hills, cold, hot, but then there's always a yurt, there's always a nice person.
That's right. Yeah.
And then into Kazakhstan.
Yeah. No, I travelled with Catherine for 2 months. She arrived not long after I'd brought the horses and just set out. She actually met me in Hatterhorden, and I said goodbye to her in a town called Ulaangom in the far west of Mongolia. So I still had another month or so to go to reach the far west of Mongolia. And yes, as a kind of, I was 24 at that point, and I had a very singular focus on my expedition. She was a school teacher who was going back to Germany to work, and there we had this concept that she could come and join me during her school holiday breaks for different legs of the journey. But yeah, she ended up getting quite ill, and the name of the issue escapes me now. It was actually a growth on her pituitary gland. The name of the condition escapes me at the moment, but it required brain surgery to remove. And I was in the midst of the toughest part of the journey in many ways, which was the desert in Kazakhstan. And I did get to see her very briefly at one point, but we broke up, and to cut a long story short, by the time I reached Hungary, she was married.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
a good measure of how long my journey took, a lot longer than I thought.
Yeah.
But I think haven't been in contact with Catherine for a while, but we have a very good relationship.
And so
she fortunately survived. I remember the name of the syndrome. It's called Cushing's syndrome.
Yeah.
So if not addressed and diagnosed soon enough, it's definitely a fatal condition. Yeah.
So you cross into Kazakhstan.
Yep.
I forget if it was on this border you had problems with the horses, but maybe on every border that was a problem.
Yeah, no. Look, as hard as Mongolia had been as my initiation, it was summertime. There were nomads who had an unbroken tradition, knowledge that they could help me with. Kazakhstan, it was the start of autumn and what turned out to be the coldest winter in about 40 years in this little corner of northeast Kazakhstan. It'd get to about minus 52. And
pretty chilly.
And a country that was still deeply traumatised by events of the 20th century and emerging from the breakup of the Soviet Union. I mean, you have to imagine that I think it was about sometime in the early 20th century, the census suggested there was something like 95 to 97% of Kazakhs nomadic.
Mm-hmm.
By the end of the 20th century, there were less than 5% people nomadic.
Wow, insane transition.
And that was largely due to the process in the 20s and 30s of Stalin's industrialization campaign that saw their possessions, i.e. their animals, taken away. It wasn't like in agrarian Russia and Ukraine where really their economy and their survival relied on their crops and their land. For Kazakhs, it was their animals. So animals were taken by the state. A famine ensued, and roughly, no one knows the exact figure, and it's still there are historical cultural wars still going on. But roughly 2.2 million nomads starved to death in that famine. After which the surviving Kazakhs really, as a instrument of survival, needed to adapt to that new reality that the Soviets had brought. Only, of course, for that reality to come crashing down with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, and there were people that I met in those early days of the trip who lived through all of those cataclysmic events, and so deeply confusing to have sacrificed so much for the Soviet concept, only for all of that to kind of disintegrate, to have that rug pulled out, and to cling to whatever they could, partially their original ancient nomadic way of life, part of what was the scraps that were left over from the Soviet era, and whatever else they could improvise. I mean, in those early times, we're still talking early 2000s, so a good 15 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, but nonetheless a deeply difficult transition, a bit of a reckoning of Kazakhs to re-identify themselves, to reconcile themselves with their ancient past, what had happened during the Soviet Union, and to come up with a picture of the future for who they were and what their country would be. So that was what I was entering, and it was, I met this man called Asset, who fortunately decided to look after me for the first 2-3 weeks, and he, like many Kazakhs I met, he had this deep nostalgia about nomadic life. He had a sense of what it was. He'd spent his life as a horse shepherd, actually, which was one of the kind of renowned as one of the toughest jobs, because you'd be out there shepherding, guarding herds of horses that are notoriously difficult to horses move 24/7. They don't have sleep cycles like the rest of us. But he inherited all the stories of how nomadic culture operated. And when he travelled with me, it was like this opportunity for him to live those out. And he had this sense that I later would be able to put into words, which was that, I guess this is the definition of nostalgia in a sense, that he deeply seemed to believe that somewhere in the future they'd be able to reunite and recreate their distant past. That beyond the cataclysmic events of today, we'll return to that history, which is totally understandable. And of course, in a way, that might be possible, but in reality, time still moves in a chronological way.
Like it's all sort of downstream of their economic opportunity, the way people live their lives.
Yeah, look, there was this sense, like there was in Mongolia as well, but in a different way, of what era do we cling to? Do we cling to our roots as an Islamic nomadic culture? Do we go further back? Do we go back to our shamanic roots, to our Tengriist roots? And they've had that debate in Mongolia as well. Because Buddhism can be seen as an import by the Manchus, who some would argue used Buddhism to pacify the Mongols. So there's that constant tension in Mongolian society today, as there is in Kazakhstan, about, well, we've got this opportunity and freedom to recreate our identity now. So what are we going to choose? And it often runs down political lines as well. Yeah. But anyway, this guy, I said, lovely man, living in a little tiny village with a handful of animals. He decides to travel with me, and at the end of that time, he's still very worried about me. And he says, you need a friend on this long road. You need someone to protect you from the wolves and keep you warm at night in the tent. And that's when he proceeded to give me this little puppy. Yeah. And he said, in our culture, dogs choose their owners, and he's definitely yours. He was this little tiny black skin and bones on stick legs, who I'd actually seen the first night I arrived in his village. Leapt all over me. He was actually his son's puppy, 6 months old. And I looked at this thing and thought, he's not going to survive more than 2 or 3 weeks. Little did I know, of course. But I very reluctantly kind of rode off with him, but within a couple of days I couldn't live without this little puppy. Yeah. And the foresight of Asset, as so many people on this trip, their foresight was far beyond what I could have imagined. And Tiggin became instrumental on my trip. I'd go to bed at night, even in those early days, and he was obviously thinking, well, thank goodness Tim's protecting me from wolves. At that point, I was paranoid still about thieves and wolves. I'd had a wolf encounter in Mongolia as well, and so I'd started to take those warnings a bit more seriously. Tiggin just took the edge off it. And in those early days, of course, he learnt to protect himself by standing underneath my horses when other big dogs and other horses attacked. But over time, he grew into this great, big, proud dog that truly became our leader. and definitely helped keep wolves and thieves and other things at bay.
And the dog's called Chicken.
Tigon.
Chigon.
Tigon. Tigon. I'm not pronouncing it correctly. It's pronounced something more like Toigon, which means goshawk or fast wind.
To jump all the way to the end, he is with you for 3 years. Well, all 2.5 from when you're given him.
Yes. Yeah.
And then a year later, you bring him to Australia. I can see there's a little imprint. Maybe that's him. Maybe that's not.
Yes, no, that's him.
How long did he live?
He lived for almost 15 years.
Yeah.
Not far from here is where I lived for 4 years while I wrote the book. And he and I would routinely roam up in the mountains. He would disappear for hours at a time chasing deer, and then he would return and need his premium meat and his pats by the wood fire. So he walked between those two worlds effortlessly. He was one with the dingoes when he was out there. But no, he unfortunately passed away just not too long before COVID. I was in Mongolia at the time, and it really.
I'm sorry to hear that.
It left a huge hole in my life. It was like I woke up one morning without him, and I realised for all those years, despite times being separated, it was such woven into the fabric of my every fibre that I didn't know how to breathe without him. Wake up in the night and not hear him breathing or snoring or having a dream in his the muffled barks and his twitching paws and those little whiskers. I knew the contours of his body with my eyes closed. We'd spent so much time. I could anticipate every emotion he had, So it was devastating when he passed away. But he had an extraordinary run. Literally, I mean, he would have travelled eventually about 10,000 kilometres. He did a lot more miles than I did. A lot of the time he'd be circling out on his own adventures, and then he'd come back in, touch base with my little caravan of horses, and then off he'd go. He was stolen several times. He came under attack several times, but somehow, luckily, one friend said luckily he wasn't a cat because they only have 9 lives. He was.
There was a. You had to go somewhere at some stage, and you had to leave Chicken with someone else. You get back and you realise he's just been abused, kicked. He's like cowering, not fed.
Oh yes, yeah.
I wrote a note here. Just how murderous did you feel when you had discovered how he'd been treated?
I mean, I've just recently become a father, and it would be the same if someone would mistreat my baby. It was, I think the situation you're referring to, I was actually in Crimea. There was a time when he was stolen and disappeared for 7 days. That's another story in Kazakhstan. But in Crimea, I was staying with a fairly rowdy bunch of Russians, and someone for whatever reason decided to kick him, and he ended up having some bruising around his liver, and there was a while there where they didn't think he was going to make it. But no, I was livid. But look, at the same time, oftentimes in this journey, I had to find a way to adapt and cope, and I couldn't get too offended every time something happened because it was just constant. There could have been but no, I remember holding him that night and thinking it could be the last moments with him, but he recovered. I was staying actually near a place called Feodosia, close to where it's believed it was during the Mongol Empire that the plague was transmitted via the Genoese to Europe, which of course devastated Europe. Like much of this journey, and when I wrote the book, there was this very personal, emotional journey going on always. But then there was also this sense of historical perspective. And as you mentioned earlier, I mean, a lot of my journey was not really focused on understanding the ancient past. It was using the ancient past to understand the current condition of nomadic cultures, be it Crimea, be it Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Mongolia. So and Tiggin became, if you like, the way I found solace at the end of a day. Or
Right. Yeah.
when I was in a place called Bakhchisarai, I was there during this big physical confrontation between Tatars and Russians who'd come from as far afield as Moscow. There was a picket line that had been created by Tatars to defend mausoleums that dated back to the early founding of the Crimean Khanate. And the Russians decided that they actually built a meat market on it after the deportation of Crimean Tatars back in the 40s. And anyway, this horrible confrontation descended into violence. They shut the town down. The army came in. At that time, the Ukrainian army, or the Ukrainian special police, they were able to essentially be peacekeepers between these two opposing sides. But I remember riding out of there. I'd never been in such a violent place before, or such a scenario. And so to ride out of something like that, retreat to my little camp. I remember camping not long after leaving Bakhchisarai on one of these canals that connect the Crimean Peninsula to mainland Ukraine. And I remember just, retreating to that bliss of cuddling up with Tiggin in the tent, 3 horses grazing outside, bathing with Tiggin in the canal, cool off in the summer heat, and thinking how blessed I was to be able to enter deeply into these really, really boiling point situations in pressure cookers that I can't imagine living in. And to be able to go back out there and carry on.
To walk away from it,
and to allow the experiences and thoughts and feelings to coalesce into ideas and written work. Tiggin, and I guess in my narrative of the book, like it was in real life, I mean, I often take the readers into very intense experiences, only to retreat and very much lighten the room with stories of Tiggin.
Right.
And which was emotionally largely how I coped for much of the time.
All throughout the journey, there were some similarities that connected their nomadic roots, like the way they would inspect the horse, the fascination they would have with your saddle. You wrote at one point that your saddle was traveling faster than you were because people had heard. There was this Australian man with this weird saddle. And, that did the job of connecting all of these different cultures. They had similar behaviors that they'd been taught, even when the people looking at the horses, maybe they'd just driven cars their whole life.
That's right. I mean, and as I mentioned earlier, I think to see in the distance, at that point I didn't know I was an Australian, but to see someone travelling by horse caravan through parts of Kazakhstan, Russia, Crimea, where they hadn't seen that perhaps in their whole life, yet they'd been brought up in stories of that life. It almost enabled them to reignite and that passion and that ability to relive their cultural traditions. They from Mongolia all the way through to Hungary, there's a lot of traditions that link them, but I think the most important one is this sense that you never let someone ride past your home without inviting them in for a cup of tea, if not a feast, slaughtering a sheep or a goat, and spending 3 days celebrating. The Mongols, like the Kazakhs, used to have this culture of, for the first 3 days, you don't have the right as the host to even ask the traveller where they're from, who they are. It's not your business to judge them. You look after them. And that was an extraordinary experience to have time and time again, right up to the end in Hungary, even in those cultures that have moved a lot further away from that life out there in the wild steppe.
Robin Davidson makes this observation from her journey in tracks, which was 8 months, that she could remember every single campsite that she'd done.
Yeah, right.
You devastatingly had your diary stolen at the end. This is months, maybe a year after in Melbourne. But can you, maybe not now, but as you were writing it, could you conjure up, almost every step of the journey?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And even now, if I'm struggling to sleep at night, I don't count sheep. I just walk my way across the steppe from camp to camp. And the challenge is to visualise and remember each and every day of 3.5 years. And I think one of the things of being so deeply connected to a landscape, like you are with animals, like with horses, it's not that you're following a line. To the contrary, you're mapping the landscape in a different way. You're looking at places that could be dangerous for them, where you could find shelter, water. So you become hyper aware of places that might have a really deep, soft soil or a swamp that could be dangerous for a horse. You get a sense of where the horses might run to if they escape. That's something I did every day. Because every night there was an opportunity. If the horses managed to break loose somehow, I've got to be able to try to predict where they might run to, which is ultimately a place that's sheltered from the prevailing wind, that has good grass. That's the crux of it. And so I mapped the journey through in that way, through the eyes of a horse, really. And for whatever reason, I had a very, very much in my mind a bird's eye visual of the landscape I travelled through. And so even now, if I look at like Google Earth, not that it was available to me back then, but I can look at it and I know it like the back of my hand.
Yeah, wow.
Because I know exactly where the parched land is, where the swamps are, where the rivers are, etc., etc. Yes, so I think it's very hard to forget that. It's becomes part of your own story in a way. Kind of navigate it like it's the landscape of your own mind.
Did you carry detailed maps to sort of figure out a direction at least the next day?
Yeah, I had. I had what they called TPC charts, with tactical pilotage charts, which were 1 to 500,000, which is not doesn't show a huge amount of detail, but they're very accurate. So in terms of using them, I had a basic GPS, which gave me a GPS coordinate, and I could aim for points on that map based on the GPS coordinate on the map, and just set a compass bearing each day.
Okay, wow.
So that was the basic way I travelled.
No.
But more important than the GPS and the maps was finding out from local people where the water and where the grass was, and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And as the journey unfolded in Kazakhstan, they would often hand me a piece of paper before I left with an introductory letter to someone in the next village or community or whatever it might be. And so I'd often had a way of introduction long before I reached, and sometimes somehow word would reach that place before I did. So it was really serendipitous. The crucial thing was to find, if possible, the more respected elder families, because when things were stolen, they knew how to get them back for me. And going back to my saddle, yes, word about my saddle spread. Sometimes, the story as it does became what they call a long ear of the steppe. It became greatly exaggerated. I remember arriving in Crimea and being introduced to, I think it was the members of the Historical Society, or maybe the organisation that runs the Khan's Palace in Bakhchisarai, and it's in the book. He introduced me as, the modern Marco Polo who spoke 13 languages and had 12 horses and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
I sat there a little bit embarrassed.
Was that the fella who ended up being overly hospitable?
Yes.
And at one point, it's like 3 a.m. You've already left town, and he rocks up and he's boozed and he wants to cook you a fish stew or something, and you just had to say, "Man, this is fucked," and move on.
No, that was another occasion. That was a mayor of a place called Bilcha Zoloty, I think, in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, yeah.
But this man similarly began waxing lyrical after quite a lot of vodka.
Yeah, what was your experience of alcoholism across the steppe?
Mongolians have a very ancient tradition of drinking. The saying goes that the reason that the empire stopped in Hungary ultimately was because the leader at the time, I think it was Ogadai Khan, you have to excuse me if I got that wrong, but he basically died of a drinking bout, a bender. And they were never able to return to their original
glory.
They weren't able to collectively agree on the future expansion of the Mongol Empire. Kind of fell a little bit into disarray. But Mongolians have always fermented horse milk. They make what's called nurmalar, which is a clear distilled drink from fermented yogurt or from curd. They famously would be very hospitable with their alcohol. But these days, Russian vodka's been introduced to most of the societies, and that's a lot more destructive than the traditional vodka.
Because I hear stories about the fermented mare's milk. Isn't it like 2-3%?
Yeah, fermented mare's milk.
Like, how do you get so plastered that you pick up alcoholism?
Well, no, it's a bit of a myth that people. I think it was perpetuated by Marco Polo, who referenced fermented mare's milk as being like a fine white wine. What he really was referring to was nurmalar, which would taste and look a little bit more like wine, and that's the distilled so-called Mongolian vodka and that's about 20 ranges, but say 15 to 20%, and people definitely get very drunk on that. Not so much on the fermented mare's milk, which is very mild.
But the vodka is a step function worse.
Yeah, look, Russian vodka 40% is kind of came to replace and undermine the local tradition of drinking nurmal. Look, like in Russia, like in all of the former Soviet Union, I think alcohol's a big major issue. Less so probably in a place like Kazakhstan than Russia itself, but no, it's a, and I have to be very careful, because not to accept vodka would be seen to be a little bit offensive. But when I'm looking after 3 horses and a dog, and there's always the real risk of them being stolen, I had to always be on my toes. I remember drinking with a gypsy man once in Ukraine, and then he actually admitted partway into this dinner, after we'd had 3 or 4 shots of vodka, I'd been sent to his home after being accosted by the local authorities, who thought I was an illegal that was preparing to transit through Transnistria, and which I wasn't. But anyway, they arranged his accommodation, and I was debriefing with this man, and he at some point said, "Well, I'm going to try and steal your horses tonight. Unless you sell them to me.
Yeah.
Which is kind of harks back to the ancient tradition of the steppe, where if you don't agree to sell your horse or give it away, and a person's fallen in love with it, well,
It's fair game.
Yeah, hang on to your horse. So I ended up spending most of that night out on the icy ground, holding the lead ropes of my horses, literally holding onto them so they wouldn't be stolen, and that often precipitated after times of drinking. And I mean, in Mongolia, I remember in the early days, multiple occasions where people tried to steal the horse, and they'd keep coming back and attempting to steal, even though they were literally legless. The only way they could move was on their horseback.
Right. So, you really, and you describe it so well, but the exposure to the elements, I remember the hot, this was maybe in Kazakhstan, but it's just unbearably hot, deathly hot even, to the point where you're walking the horses at night, in darkness, finding shade during the day, and then the cold, just the bitter cold. Yeah.
Look, the winter was one thing, but I've been looking forward to that. Riding across a snow-covered landscape gives you unbelievable freedom to travel in any direction you like. The animals eat the snow to hydrate themselves. I lived in fear of summer, and it was even harder than I had imagined. Unfortunately, the way it worked out, I ended up being in the warmest part of Kazakhstan at the hottest time of the year, where they have every year more or less consistently 40 days in a row of above 40 degrees. And the only way to survive was to ride at night time. I'd pack up, saddle the horses after dark. I would ride through the night by compass bearing. We'd kind of run into these herds of camels and horses. Sometimes I'd be so tired that I'd kind of slump in the saddle or get off, fall asleep. But the aim was to find somewhere to shelter before that great big ball of fire re-emerged over the horizon. And it smelt like death, that heat. There was nowhere to turn, no shade. The only shade I could create sometimes was by putting all the felt and woolen blankets of the horses over my tent. And that way I'd still be in a pool of sweat, but a lot warmer than a tent, a lot cooler than a tent. But that coincided with the end of spring, when you got a lot of stallions racing around, and I was trying to protect my horses. I'd have a pile of sticks and rocks, and if you're trying to rest during the day, getting up and throwing rocks and sticks. But ultimately, these attacking stallions, but ultimately it was the people that came to my rescue. In that part of Kazakhstan, they have underground huts where they spend a lot of their time during the day. But emotionally, it was the hardest time of the trip, as well as physically, because I'd spend time with these families that were just retreating, this incredible sense of togetherness. And as the cool air began to whisper its way across the land and people emerged to have dinner and that type of thing, that was when I had to kind of get back on the road and kiss goodbye this sense of sanctuary. And so to emotionally get through that, one of the things I did was, even though I was travelling at night, I'd put sunscreen on, because the smell of the sunscreen reminded me of time at the beach where I grew up in Gippsland, and something about the desert sand and the smell of sunscreen just gave me a little bit of comfort.
Like you were just walking along 1 Mile Beach.
Yeah, but no, it was hard, and there were times when I had to go 2 days at a time without water. For the horses, it was really tough. But thanks to the people we managed to get.
What about this abandoned gold mine village? Maybe not abandoned, but at least totally decrepit. I remember you had hoped to get through it before the most hectic part of winter came. Yeah. And then you ended up having to stay there for 3-4 months or something.
Yeah, look,
Does that sound right? And it felt like a completely hollow, desolate, depressing, sad town.
It was. And yet, like in all of these places beneath the surface, there's these incredible stories of people who, beyond all odds, retain that sense of warmth and positivity. But I was riding through the Betpak Dala, which is translated to something similar to the hungry steppe or the starving steppe. It was winter, a place that nomads would never have been at that time of year. 2 days before Christmas, I pulled out the map. A horse was getting an abscess in its hoof. Tent seemed to be falling apart. I was unable to get proper GPS coordinates, or maybe I was looking for excuses. So I looked on the map. There's a place called Akbakai and just convinced myself I had to get there. I got there as quickly as I humanly could, but arrived Christmas Eve in the dusk, just a frozen mess, unable to kind of utter barely a word. And there's these couple of shadowy figures who came out, thought I was a lost Russian geologist, invited me back to their hut. And at first, of course, I wasn't alone. I was warm, but in the morning, this different picture began to emerge, of a very morally and in every other way bankrupt town that was once singularly a town that survived on the extractive industries, gold mining.
Like a shell of mining collapse.
Yeah, look, towns like that all across the Soviet Union, they call them monogorods, so towns based exclusively on one industry that were just left to their own devices when the Soviet Union collapsed. And, this place was just post-apocalyptic. I remember even as I rode in there was this apartment building. All the windows were, gone, smashed. There was no heating, there was no water. It was just this strange monolith of concrete amongst the rubble and tailings of the gold mine, hundreds of kilometres from anywhere. And on the third or fourth story, there was this Kazakh guy who had a fire going in the apartment building and kind of sealed up the window with plastic. And he was scrapping a living by building furniture in the old basement of the apartment building in what used to be a pool in Soviet. And in the old pool, he had his little workshop building furniture for the local people. And he, like all the people living in that building, were essentially squatting. And the men I lived with, Grisha and Vitka, they were Russian men who had lost their truck driving licenses years before, caught driving drunk at the wheel. They'd never left. They were scrapping a living, just in kind of servitude to
But when
the
you
local.
say you're living, it's a drug addiction and alcohol addiction.
Alcohol addiction. So they had some terrible stories. I remember Grisha, one of them telling me that you've got to meet my wife. She's the most admirable, honest woman that you'd ever find. The time she murdered our neighbour in our kitchen with a knife, she called the police herself. Only a few more years and she'll be out of prison. Vitka had this terrible backstory where I think his daughter had been killed riding a bicycle, and anyway, both their lives were in free fall. And they were inhabiting this little shack just by the grace of a local person who they were collecting firewood for, I think, and they were actually raising puppies to eat to survive. They had this kind of, as I have met on many, many occasions, living with the pungent smell of alcohol, Russian tobacco, and this. I remember this frying pan that was had decades, it appeared, of fat and ash and probably cigarette ash and everything, and it was just blackened and still cooking completely
inedible food.
Yeah, but after a bottle of vodka, they're still frying up potato in it, and they've got these little puppies next to it that they're preparing to eat shortly. They went out and caught some pigeons in a trap, boiled them up for Christmas dinner, and And that was just the beginning. I mean, my woes were obviously insignificant. A lot of people here were surviving off the contraband gold mine industry, so rappelling deep into these old shafts.
Abandoned shafts. To try and pick off the scraps.
Yes, well, or to continue mining that had been previously abandoned by the state. And then, many people had fallen to their death in these mines in the previous year. And basically, the way it worked in this town was that everyone hidden secretly out the back, or not so secretly, they were using their own process of sodium cyanide and mercury the word escapes me, but to distill down gold, which they'd then sell onto the contraband market for about $10 a gram.
Yep.
So a picture emerged of a pretty desperate place at that point in my life, the most desperate place I'd ever experienced, and it was such a world away from the utopian nomadic life that I had visions of, and that I'd spent so long in Kazakhstan imagining.
Right.
But fortunately, I was rescued by this man called Baidak, who wandered into the hut. He was kind of one of the benefactors, if you like, keeping Vitka and Grisha alive at that point, bringing them food and work from time to time. And Baidak took me under his wing. He had a underground hut and a little cafe. He'd created improvised a fence around his property with flattened sodium cyanide drums, and there was no running water in the town, so he had a cellar full of bottled water that he had trucked in. And under his wing, we found somewhere for the horses to be looked after outside the town. There's no hay or grain around. But during that time I got sick. The weather came in. I couldn't leave. And then on the eve of leaving on one occasion, Tikin was stolen by unemployed mine workers. Not Grisha and Vitka, but someone else who I'll never know exactly who it was. But
And you're fearful that he's been eaten?
Yeah, for a week. I thought that's it. I had this terrible dream of him blackened with tar and staring out at me in my dreams, calling for me but not being able to find me. And eventually this man Baidak did find him, miraculously, put him in a sauna for a day with a concoction of raw eggs and vodka.
He loved eggs, didn't he?
Yeah. Baidak, when we went to his palace, that's what it was to us. He just brought out one egg after another, and Tigan ate a giant bowl full of old stale bread in milk until his belly was just about to pop, but he just couldn't stop eating. We'd landed in paradise, with Baidak, and Baidak had this incredible pride in ancient Russian traditions, and he had an old Kazakh saddle, much like the one I've got now in my home. And he was still, despite living in this place, you could see his eyes light up talking about those traditions and that previous life, and how much pride he had in keeping horses. He actually had a herd of his own horses that were living essentially wild out on the steppe. And he said, "Oh, look, every winter a few of them get stolen and eaten, but whatever." Allah looks down on all of us and he sees everything, so my conscience is clear.
But you had essentially this open passport culturally because you were channeling this old nomadic tradition which they all romanticize and wanted to go into.
That's right.
Had you been on your bike, for instance, they wouldn't have looked at you the same way, right? There'd be less respect, maybe more opportunism.
I think arriving by any other means, I would have been a novelty, a kind of a fleeting novelty for someone they didn't quite understand. But on horseback, it was a conundrum for them because on one hand, I was as familiar as their own, more familiar in some ways than many of their own, because they'd grown up on their fathers' and grandparents' stories of nomadic life. So they knew everything about me and the horses and how they should treat me. And yet I was Australian and in the modern...
But speaking Russian, right? All the
time? Yes,
speaking
Russian, And in the modern era, very few of they'd find very few of themselves travelling long distances by horse. So, whether be it Hungary or Crimea, Kalmykia, Cossacks, despite the fact that I was on the trail ostensibly of the Mongols, I was really on the trail of nomads more generally. The Mongols, of course, being
king of the nomads.
Yeah, the most well-known and perhaps the largest, or definitely the largest nomad.
The most romanticised.
But certainly not the only empire. So
because we're still in Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
And we haven't made it to Ukraine yet, where you learned the news from your father.
Oh, that's right. Yep.
But before that, this journey, how many times did you sink into a pretty deep depression and nihilism, and I just want to throw in the towel, fuck this, you know?
Look, I could probably safely say that I never really thought about throwing in the towel, but I did think that I'd have to throw in the towel a few times if things didn't work out. And one example of that was the border between Kazakhstan and Russia. Just before reaching the border, the Kazakh police came out, made me follow their patrol vehicle back to the station. I had to unpack the whole horses. They confiscated my passport. They said I needed to check whether I was potentially a terrorist because Chechnya wasn't far, etc., etc. This type of thing had happened before, but it was a kind of a good portent of what was to come, because I was about to kind of enter this extremely difficult, the thickets of bureaucracy, as opposed to the searing deserts and the storms of winter. So when I first tried to cross the border, I was able to convince the Kazakhs to allow me to leave with the animals. But after crossing no man's land into Russia, at the border, they turned me back and they said, look, you have no permit for taking your animals into our country. Either surrender your animals here and go on alone, or return home. So I had no choice, of course, but to go back. But the borders were only open for till midnight or something. So by the time I got back, the border was closed. I grazed my horses for a day or a night in no man's land. Came back to the border with Kazakhstan, but the shift had changed and no one recognised me, and so they refused at first to let me back in. I then met one particular customs officer who took a liking to my dog, Tigan, and said, look, if you give me your dog, I'll grant you a permit to come back in, and what's more, to get back into Russia. I refused to do that, obviously. And eventually there was an agreement where they allowed me back in, but only if I were to go to stay with the family near the border. They knew where I was. And then I had to go back and extend my visa I could do it by 2 months or something. And then it was just this giant battle to get permits to leave Kazakhstan again. I had to get a wild animal export license to take the horses out. And then I had to get a transit permit for the horses. But technically a transit permit came from the authorities in Moscow, and usually the horses in this day and age are transported by truck or train. There was no provision laid out in the legislation for an animal to travel by its own 4 feet, or for someone to ride them. And so this was a conundrum, and we were blocked right up until a few days before my visa expired. And that was one of the moments where I thought, well, I'm going to have to throw in the towel, because if I have to give up my animals now, my 3 horses and Tigan, well, it's not worth continuing, because they've become the trip. It'll be a failure, and I will have failed them, essentially. So, but it was unbelievable. I walked back into the Kazakh, the local Department of Agriculture on the border that had been helping me, faxing back and forth to Moscow, and they were about to go on break. I'd almost given up hope, and I got there, and there was this lady. She was just like trembling and holding up this fax, that she just received from Moscow.
Nice.
And because of all of the persistence, someone nice in Moscow had sent this beautiful fax that said, this grants permission for the 4 horses to travel on their own feet with Tim riding them, and for the dog Tigan to travel svoim chodom, which means basically, on his own 4 feet by himself.
Yeah.
And it was just like this. There was definitely an angel looking.
There's
over
also
us at that
death
point.
by bureaucracy.
I mean, I then had to race to the border where the horses were. By that stage, the Tigan had disappeared, been stolen. The customs officer lived nearby. Anyway, he turned up again. Horses were all there. Goodness knows what happened to them in the meantime. But I got out with 1 day left on my visa,
And
or on the last day of my visa, it might have been. And it was just, after 6 weeks or 2 months of that living in constant uncertainty about whether the trip was possible or not.
Oh, you had 6 weeks in that bureaucracy?
Yeah, well, almost 2 months, I think.
Fucking hell.
I got through, and I just, they let me into Russia, and I just felt like a free person.
Wow.
But ironically, I soon later arrived in a place called Kalmykia, this Buddhist republic in southern Russia, which is actually populated by essentially Mongolian nomads who had they'd been there since the 17th century, it was a game of cat and mouse for me in Russia because I didn't technically have a permit for riding horses through the country. There's no such thing. And to ensure that I did things correctly, in each province I travelled through, I needed to get a vet check, that I still had everything according to my customs declaration. And technically, because they were in transit, I wasn't allowed to stop anywhere. Unfortunately, in Kalmykia, while overnighting on a farm, one of my horses stepped on a big rusty nail. And we stayed there while it healed, but it turned out to be an infection that, despite treatment, wouldn't recover. That was what the local vets told me. So I had to make the kind of heartbreaking decision then to move on without that horse. And
Which was the horse you left behind?
He was a horse called Kork, which means like grey or green. It actually depicts a grey horse, but it means green in Kazakh. And I've still got this kind of feeling of terror in my eyes when I remember when we rode out of there, because he could barely walk. He couldn't walk on that foot, and he tried to kind of stumble after us, but eventually, realised that his herd was leaving him.
That's heartbreaking.
So those type of moments were heartbreaking for me. And it wasn't that I was physically stopped from going forwards, but the meaning of the journey had become so invested in my animals, and this increasingly rich connection I had with Tigan and the horses, that without them, it kind of would have been an empty, meaningless journey to finish without them.
Yeah.
And so, yes, the battle of bureaucracy to get into Russia, out of Russia into Ukraine, out of Ukraine into Hungary, it certainly became one of the many themes of the challenge. Yeah.
There is a detail which pops up again and again and again, starting in Mongolia, even finishing in Hungary. But the sort of conversation that your partners you would be riding with, people you would be staying with, whenever it was just men, would always come back to some type of prostitution.
Oh yeah.
Like, how do you, it's probably not the best question to ask in front of your newborn son, but did that sour your view of these cultures in a sense?
Yeah, well, look, it became more and more apparent to me that, like anywhere in the world, I think when there's a complete deficit of women, and there's lots of men about, there can be this toxic narrative that starts, and the conversation often plumbs the depths of some pretty...
But almost directly, it felt like.
Oh, no, definitely. I grew up in Gippsland, Victoria. My parents were school teachers. I knew nothing of alcoholism growing up. I knew about rural life, and I'd played enough Australian football and spent enough time at kind of booze-ups in my teen years, where I'd seen a lot of, and I heard a lot of what I found fairly, at that time for me, pretty shocking language and behaviour about women. But nonetheless, I just, nothing prepared me for what I experienced. But I mean, I remember arriving, I think it's in the book, in Kazakhstan, and I'm out there riding with this man called Ruslan, and it was a beautiful environment. Just, it was autumn. It was a kind of autumnal ocean of grasslands, all kind of moving in the wind. I just bought my horses in the Altai Mountains, and we were galloping down to this steppe, and we came to a walk, and he turned to me, and I thought he was going to apologise for disappearing on a 5-day bender several days earlier, but instead he came and just asked something like, so how much do girls cost in Australia? I said, what do you mean? You know, and that became a pretty common starting point of conversations with men across the steppe. Partly, I think, because of their perception of the Western world, and too many Hollywood movies where within a fleeting moment these two meeting couples are in bed.
Where women are beautiful and easy.
That's right. And whilst in a place like Kazakhstan, that's been Islamic since I think the 13th century, it's extremely important for women to remain virgins until their wedding night, essentially. And so obviously the conclusion of that is, you know, having a girlfriend is definitely taboo. So there's in villages all the way through, prostitution is just an open reality, which was confronting for me, because obviously I hadn't grown up ever really facing that or knowing about that.
Seeing it up close, was there something more revolting about it than you maybe would have initially thought, or did it just become like you began to sympathise and understand with the situation, and it became less judgmental?
Yeah, look, I think there came a certain point, and I remember it pretty clearly in southern Russia. I mean, there were comical moments, if you could depict it like that, like where I'd wake up in the night and there'd be someone that's come to my tent door, or some Cossacks coming into my tent, and they'd met me earlier in the day, and they come back and say, look, we've brought a lovely prostitute from the village for you, and they'd all kind of crowdfunded this girl to come. And you know, like I was taken aback by that type of thing.
Yeah, and they must think you're either really rude or gay, or something's wrong with you for saying no to it.
No, the common perception was that I was either gay or using prostitutes. There was nothing else possibly being between.
Exactly.
But in this place called Timashevsk, I ended up spending about 6 weeks there while I battled with bureaucracy to get my horses into Ukraine, and I fell in with a man called Luti, who was a bit of a local overlord, a baron, if you like. He was ostensibly a wheat farmer, but there was a lot more going on there in the industrial complex that I was put up in. I'd go into his little smoky office every now and then, and he'd throw a couple of $100 bills over the bench and say, buy some cigarettes or something.
Mm.
And he and his kind of assistants would often go off on these weekends of, debaucherous partying where they'd rent a sauna out and have, you can imagine what unfolded. And when that became increasingly confronting for me, because I was relying on Luti and his comrades, and they were often inviting me for these weekends, and I was always refusing, and they thought there was something very wrong with me.
Mm.
But I guess I was morally confronted, and I probably came across as being prude, and on self-reflection, perhaps given my upbringing, I was. I guess what I found really confronting in the end was that I started to feel like I was complicit in their kind of moral, what I saw as a little bit of moral depravity, because I was relying on them for all my help.
Yeah.
I was living with them. They were helping me to find someone to look after the horses. Through their connections, I was getting all the paperwork ready, trying to find a way to get through the Russian border and into Ukraine. And so perhaps because of that sense of complicity, when you're so deep into it, they no longer saw me as being Australian. Now, by this point, I'm speaking fluent Russian. I don't really feel like I can be a third-person detached observer as a journalist or a writer should be. I was very much involved and dependent on them.
Mm-hmm.
My editor felt that I was being, in my initial first draft of the book, far too judgmental of them. And he said, look, you need to step back, and like for your most of the time on your journey, you need to be more curious, to understand what's brought this society to this point, or these men to this behaviour.
Nice. Good note.
Rather than be offended by it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd kind of fight back and say, well, look, at this point it's very hard for me to take a step back because I was so vested and dependent on them. But in the end, yes, I was able to put them into context with everything I was learning.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was really confronting, and it wasn't easy to remain an observer and not become deeply drawn in to it, and also to have my own views challenged. I think that's the thing about travel. Oftentimes,
Yeah.
In the near and far, that you meet people who have a different worldview that challenges the premise of the way that you see the world.
You become more.
You become more defensive.
You become more empathetic to the realization that you would perhaps be exactly like this if you had this set of experiences.
Potentially,
like there's nothing special about you for being the way you are.
That's right.
It's really a combination of all the things you've experienced up until that point and the way you've dealt with them. But I don't know about you, but had I been born very middle class in Kazakhstan, I think I'd be on my high horse if I pretended like I would have put my nose up morally to this type of behaviour.
Yeah.
Just don't think that'd be the case.
No.
Yeah.
And so that brought me to, I remember sitting down with a priest in a nearby village to Timoshevsk, and that was while I was living with these guys, and he sat down and he said, look, I can't quite remember his exact words, but it was essentially something like, a cut takes a week to heal, a broken bone takes 6 months to heal, but the type of trauma that people experienced during Soviet times, especially during the 20s and 30s, that takes generations to heal, especially when the moral basis of society is pulled away and kind of destroyed, which it was during Soviet times. And for him, of course, that meant the church, which was the institution, if you like, that that supported and held communities together at a very grassroots level. So that helped put things into context for me. But it also just shone a light on how naive I was. You know?
Right.
I mean, that type of behaviour is not uncommon in my own country. It's just it wasn't my personal, personal experience growing up.
All right, so we get through Kazakhstan, we get through the bureaucracy of Russia, we enter into Ukraine. You gave an explanation for some of your experiences early throughout there, but how far is it into Ukraine when you get the call about your father?
Well, I'd spent 3 months in Crimea. That was a really tough time for me. Obviously, much tougher for the local Tatar population that were being kind of prosecuted in many ways by Russians who lived in Sevastopol and elsewhere. But I came out of Crimea, really quite down, and this sense of injustice was overwhelming me about what was happening to these people in Crimea. But I thought, well, look, I've only got a couple of thousand k's left to Hungary, and luckily I can move on from this. Surely I've been through the biggest challenges by now. I enter Ukraine, it's kind of a breadbasket of Europe, as you might imagine, just incredible, unbelievable fertile fields that just stretch to the horizon day after day. You're riding suddenly not through steppe, but through little back roads and these beautiful little villages where there's still the clopping of the horse and cart, where people are still using the common land around the village for grazing their milk, their dairy cow and their sheep, as well as going to the larger fields. It all seemed to be coming to an end, but I was probably about 1,000 kilometres into Ukraine when, and 1,000 k's from the end, approaching a place called Koma, or I'd just gone through Koma, which is in the north part of Odessa Oblast. And it was autumn, so it was getting cold in the evenings. I was riding along, it was getting dark. I was looking into a gully, see if I could see some fodder for the animals, a good place to camp. And my satellite phone, which I'd left on accidentally, started beeping. And eventually I thought, I better get off and check it. So I got off the horse, pulled it open, and there was a message to call directly to home urgently. Called home, and it wasn't actually my mum or any of my family that answered. It was a family friend of ours we'd known since I was a kid, and I knew something was up when they answered. And of course, I soon learned that my dad had been in a car accident that day and died instantly. Here I was, sun was falling, dark, cold, got very impatient, hungry horses. They've had a long day, Tiggin. I just went into this kind of autopilot mode where I'd already left Ukraine. I wasn't there. I was somewhere back home with Dad. But that other kind of part of me somehow made it down to a gully, made camp. And then all night I was on the sat phone trying to arrange plane tickets from Kiev back to Australia, arranging somewhere for the horses to be. And the next morning I rode the horses back to Koma, where I'd stayed on a collective farm, an old collective farm. And I remember riding the horses back, and it was just, by this stage I haven't slept for 24 hours, and it was a very, very misty, cold morning, and the sun was kind of, shining through it, and there were so many times during that ride where it was like I could see from the corner of my eye my dad, wandering through the forest next to me, looking at the trees, when I was a kid, I can remember seeing his calf muscles and an old backpack. And one thing that stuck with me, I don't know what age I was, but him kind of kneeling down and saying, isn't life amazing? And just picking up a plant. And that had stuck with me to this day. Unfortunately, Dad had retired a year before, very early. He was only 55. He had been planning to come and spend some time with me. It didn't happen. But I think, my mum has always said, he should have got married about 20 years later than he did, because he had this will to travel, but he had first of 4 children when he was 28, when I was born, and life ever since had been about family and career. And anyway, I that stuck with me, but I held on to that. I wasn't yet ready to move on, so I went home to Australia, left the horses and dog behind, and then for the next 4 or 5 months it was obviously just, we were all, me and my 2 brothers, sister. My brother had been in Chile studying on exchange, and my sister was, I think, in Melbourne. Anyway, we all convened, and I spent almost 4 months, or 4.5 months even, at home, and I had to make that decision. Do I go back and finish a trip or not? And ultimately, I left Australia feeling like I left too early, but had neglected my animals too long. Fortunately, the director of the collective farm had been looking after Tigan personally and the horses all that time, which was no mean feat. But I can, especially compared to my siblings, like they had to go back to their studies, their work, whatever. I was able to return to spring and just let that grief play out as I travelled onwards. I loved the chapter that I wrote about my dad and his death. But my editor, Anton, who became, if you like, my mentor, and I think editors always, there's a misconception outside the writing world that editors are like ghostwriters that get in there, or like teachers that get in there with a red pen and alter your work. In my experience, editors have never done that. They challenged me, like our Anton did, to write better, and they equipped me with a few concepts and tools, but they were brutally honest when it needed to be. And he told me that that I wasn't good at writing about personal things, and that this chapter just didn't fit at all, and we might have to consider leaving Dad's death out altogether of the book, more or less. So that challenged me to rewrite the book, rewrite that chapter, and put everything in context. And there were a few things I did. And when the book was all said and done, I got this nice note from my editor to say that his favourite chapter in the whole book was about my dad's death, and how I'd contextualise that in the greater story.
Yeah. You do write really movingly about particularly the mirage that you saw. Yeah. And then that point you just made where you could return to complete this journey. Yeah. Which, although is very consuming at all times, it's still free.
Yes. Yeah. I think a pivotal moment for me was, and this is in the book as well, I think, was going back to Ukraine, riding out of the collective farm. My poor horses were a shadow of themselves, former selves. They'd been in a barn for all winter. The muscles had atrophied. They had been standing in fetlock high cow manure for all that time in a dairy shed, essentially. But I was able to locate very easily the last campsite that I'd been in when I then knew that my dad had been alive. And I camped on the exact spot, put the tent on the same footprint of where my tent had been. It's the same little, you could still see the depression. Really? The snow had melted, and there it was, you could see. And it was this haunting experience of putting down my tent and realising that, my former self with a father had been here, and this symbolised from this point, this is my last campsite where I can hang on to having a dad, and beyond this, I'm riding into the unknown, you know, without a dad, and that was very, very powerful for me. And ironically, the last 1,000 or whatever it was, 1,500 k's to the end, in many ways, the easiest part of the journey, getting into richer and richer fertile landscapes. Where gone are the worries about finding enough grass. There are no wolves. Obviously, I didn't anticipate another winter. There's no
Not as much
deserts.
theft culture,
But
more prosperous people.
that's right. But life felt acutely fragile in a way. And I remember meeting this lady, Verona, who might have been 90, if memory serves me right. It's in the book. And I was sitting there having lunch by a stream, and down she came, barefoot, herding her little goats, and she invited me back to her family home. And I learnt that she'd learnt to read, I think, at the age of 80, and she told me this long story, partly by her children who were there as well, over the dinner table, but how she'd somehow survived Holodomor and the famine in Stalin's time during that industrialisation campaign. She'd somehow survived that era despite seeing so many of her loved ones as a child die or be sent off, never to be seen again. She'd seen those horrors. She'd then been through World War II. She lived in a part of Ukraine that would have been pretty fiercely fought between the Nazis and Russia. She'd then witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union, and here she was at 90, still alive, and here was my dad in one of the safest, most prosperous countries on the planet. My dad was born in 1950, hadn't witnessed any of this in his lifetime, but he died in a car crash at 55, and it all was very perplexing for me at the time. How can it be? How come his story ended at that age? And so I was very acutely aware of that as I kind of rode towards the natural end of my journey.
What are you acutely aware of there?
Well, I became acutely more aware of risks, just generally, that there are so many missteps you can make, knowing unwittingly or otherwise, that can randomly bring your demise. And I'd trodden this thread, and here was my dad. He'd retired at 55 and had 1 year of retirement, and life is kind of wiped out.
And he had ironic. Very briefly fallen asleep at the wheel.
Yes.
Which is what happened.
Yeah.
Which, I was feeling it today. I feel it every time I get on the highway, actually, especially because I got this tiny little Toyota Prius.
Yep.
And for the listeners, between Melbourne and where we are now is wombats, kangaroos. They litter the sides of the roads because they're jumping out all the time.
It's gruesome,
and like that risk is aware to me. It's like, despite my best effort here, I'm a slave to this animal jumping out. There's very little I can do. I mentioned the car because with a tiny car like that, you're quite fragile.
A large kangaroo is at 110 kilometers an hour.
Like it'll go through. It's not like it's going to break the windscreen, but it'll go through the car. Yeah. But that digression is just to sort of make an analysis on the point you made about being more aware of risk. So your father is driving a road he probably drove 1,000 times.
That's right.
And then here you are 2.5, 3 years into a trip where that is objectively, by every measure, more risky. So like you were, in a sense, still rolling the dice, not necessarily to death, but to pretty bad outcomes. At any point you could have fallen off the horse, could have gotten sick. There was one crazy night where there's like 10 wolves howling around your camp, and you're just out there like a madman with an axe, like trying to scare them off.
Or, I mean, as they said, the most dangerous wolf is the one that walks on two legs. And
Right.
there was a really lovely guy in Russia once who probably in somewhere in, might have been Stavropol or Kuban, and he came up to my tent in the evening and said, "Look, we're coming back with my Cossack mates tonight, and we're going to kind of, what did he say? We're going to throw you in the, we're going to stab you or cut you up with an axe and throw you out there to the yabbies to eat, and we'll sell your horses to the meat factory." Something like that. So I slept with my little hand axe next to my pillow that night. Of course, they never came back.
Yeah.
But I had many a night. The worst fear, of course, was being seen, and it wasn't uncommon for someone to turn up after dark, and you just never knew what the outcome might be. But yeah, wolves and everything else. There were so many strands to my experience. You know, there was at that point my own personal journey that was coming to a natural end, and part of that, of course, was returning to a world, starting to think about returning to a world without a dad, without my horses and without Tiggin. There was the part of me now firmly looking at the world through nomadic eyes and realising how many misperceptions there are about nomads, and how incredibly ignorant Europeans must have been when nomads came out of that great big kind of Neverland to the east. You know, by the time they reached villages in Central and Eastern Europe, those nomads, let's say it's a Mongol soldier, they've traversed the world. They've been through extraordinary diversity of challenging geographies. They've seen a huge diversity of cultures, of societies, and by the time they kind of travel over these Carpathian mountains, I mean, quite naively, they blocked the passes of the Carpathians, I think with timber, thinking that might be a bulwark to the Mongols. Of course, it was, you know, the Carpathians, compared to the type of landscape they've come from, it's so easy to navigate. They break all the rules, and so I'm kind of looking at the world through that eyes as I come into Hungary. I'm looking at the future of nomadism, you know, and I'm kind of looking to Hungary as well. You know, is this what the future holds for all nomadic nations? A country that at that point was already part of the European Union, still a land with no fences, where people have a great pride in their nomadic heritage, but they no longer really live it out. At least the majority of people don't. Is that the future of nomadism? And I'm thinking back to places like Kazakhstan, where, you know, what's the future of nomadism there? Are people really going to return to the past or not? What the pattern I had seen and I had with me as I finished was thinking back to some of these big areas of land that the government had started to lease out, like on 70-year pastoral leases, where suddenly nomads or people who descended from nomads were still living on that land, were now forced to confront a difficult decision. You know, do I remain on this land that's now being leased by probably a wealthy business person from a city or a town? Do I become an employee and subservient to them and continue to live on my ancestral land? Or do I leave and go somewhere else? You know, is that the future of some of these nomadic cultures? It's different in each part of those. But anyway, that's part of what I was thinking about when I kind of came to the end. I was thinking about the land itself, and how the landscape, as I reached closer and closer into Europe, how the pure density of population changed the way that people viewed the world.
Yeah.
The way that it might sound trivial, but to me it was kind of mind-boggling how once you have a world where with roads, there weren't fences, but even with roads and wheat fields, crop farming, people mentally could only really map their land via the roads that they travelled. And by arriving on horse, I'd ask, how do you get to the next village? They couldn't tell you, well, it's along that creek, through that forest and over that hill. It'd be down that road and then take a left. And I realised they had no idea. They didn't have a geographical mind map of their landscape. Whilst I could tell at a glance at that point exactly where the natural path would be for a horse person like myself. And so I would break those rules and just set off, and of course I'd reach that village
That's amazing.
in a much quicker time. And I started to think about how in a world where we all start to map our landscape through the prism of roads and buildings and human constructs like towns, we just are oblivious to the lay of the land in the way that a nomad still is today in a place like Mongolia or Kazakhstan. So they're the type of thoughts that were buzzing away in my mind as I kind of came closer and closer. The Hungarians was another chapter of the story in itself, because of course they'd come riding out in the 10th century into the Carpathian Basin, conquered the area, formed a nation, and they saw me as walking in the shadow of their own ancestors. So once again, despite the fact that the Mongols, of course, had laid waste to Hungary, infamously quite a brutal campaign in Hungary, and there's still a lot of grudges held by Hungarians as a result. Nonetheless, I was accepted with open arms because I was kind of carrying the flame of the torch, if you like, of nomad cultures. So all those things were percolating through me. I guess I was thinking about, what do I do when I get home?
Yeah. You write in those reflecting moments at the end of the book that you're worried that when you get back home, people wouldn't be able to relate to who you had become. It's now more than 20 years on from the journey, at least when you started it.
20 years.
Do you still feel that?
Yeah, look, I think, and I've been back to Mongolia pretty much every year since then. I think eventually I feel like I just become, in the same way that you can be bi or trilingual, I've had to accept and adapt to the realities here. But there lives on this burning sense of happiness inside of me to know what lives over there.
Right.
That life goes on, and to think of that world that I've had an opening to. But definitely when I arrived back, it was very confronting to think that no one could really relate to what I'd experienced. And that's still the case. I mean, it's the nature of a solo journey that there are a lot of memories that I have that didn't make it to the book, etc. That only make sense to me.
But it's also so foreign of something to relate to.
Yeah, and when I got back, I mean, I found myself feeling empty, because I left this life that meant so much to me. I left my animals and Tiggin, and I'd walked so proudly into these places with my animals, and I'd started being unable to ride and ended feeling like I was really uplifted by these animals. And I'd kind of come to see the world, nomads talk about pedestrian cultures and horseback cultures. And from horseback, pedestrian life doesn't look particularly good.
No.
Horseback life's pretty good. You're up high, you can go anywhere you want. there's this sense of empowerment as well, which it's hard to describe, and it's not a sense of, Mongolians, unlike traditionally in the West, their relationship with horses is not about breaking the will of an animal. It's about harnessing the incredible energy and power of these animals, and that in turn empowers you, empowered me. So to kind of arrive there and then to go home without the animals, without Tiggin, to a world where what I'd experienced made very little sense to the vast majority of people was really tough. And
Victoria wouldn't have changed in those 3 years.
Well,
back to that total familiarity.
That's right. I was returning to a world that was equally as naive about where I'd been as it had always been, but in a strange way, because I'd been away so long, my siblings had grown up so much in that time. I'd lost my dad. I came back kind of, unlike all my other travels, I came back kind of wanting to return to a bit more familiarity. But dynamics had changed, my dad being the primary one, having no longer being there, and that shifts, of course, your dynamics with your mum and siblings and all that kind of thing. But yeah, I was clinging on to all those things that reassured me that what I'd experienced was real, that I wasn't just imagining it, which is why it was, I think you're probably leading into this, but so heartbreaking when I had a whole bunch of my diaries stolen.
Yeah, so that occurs later in the epilogue. At one point, you're joined by a filmmaker, a videographer, and you go to his house, and you have all these diaries from your trip, and they're stolen from your car. And, like I said to you when we were talking before the podcast, but it's just like, I couldn't, for me, somehow that was the most devastating part, of the book. Obviously you have personal relationships that are devastating, but as a reader, having just consumed this journey, and I can imagine, because you write so beautifully, like you feel in your heart, I have this great story that I really want to be telling, and to almost feel like the contents are ripped from you. The sense of hopelessness, pointlessness of the journey. I can imagine you went through all these stages.
Oh, yeah.
But then, I mean, you still produce it and you can still remember it. And yeah, I think you run the book as well, that as you did start to write it, it always just opened up to you,
Yeah, look, I think there were some silver linings, and I'll explain to that experience. But it did feel at the time that it was easy, would have been, and I probably did, kind of spiral into a sense of being a victim of a world that wanted to rob me of all these experiences and perceptions that I'd had that would challenge the premise of our life here. A world where trespass is a very meaningful word, and private property is such an obsession. I come from a land where there are no fences, freehold doesn't exist, and it's a right for everyone to have a home when they're born. I mean, there's no question about that. I return to Mongolia every year, and for the nomads out there, even the poorest of nomads, really their riches are measured by how many animals they have. Having a home is really never up for debate. So I'll never know who stole them. But look, it wasn't long after that I found myself in New York, approaching with my literary agent a number of publishers, and I'd written intentionally a sample chapter of the book based on a section of the journey for which I'd lost my diaries, because I knew that I had to somehow prove to myself that I could write without using them as a crutch. I managed to do that, and managed to meet this wonderful editor called Anton Mueller, and a publisher from George. His last name escapes me right now, but George from Bloomsbury, and they at once wanted to make this the best literary piece of work that they could, and I really liked them, and the rest is history. I ended up getting a contract to write for them. But the process for me writing a book is, the first chapter, the first draft is the most exciting, because I'll kind of prep myself for days and weeks. And by that, I mean getting right into the headspace. Some of the great things about diaries sometimes are not necessarily the words, but the feelings that they can evoke, the memories. The memories are there, but it's the feeling, in my opinion, for writing, it's the feeling that matters. If you want to write evocatively, there has to be feeling. And that to me could be the nature of my handwriting, which reminds me that I was so deliriously tired, but feeling a sense of exaltation that night. I can feel that and see that in my handwriting. But I can also see the muddy paw print of Tiggin on the page, because I remember that he was hungry and wanting his dinner, and he's pawing my page saying, come on, finish your writing so we can have food. In some diaries there's still a bit of sand that falls out from that entry because it was a storm and there was sand in the air. So those type of things in a diary are like a live wire that you can grab onto, and it takes you right back. And I can go into a kind of a tunnel experience of writing for a long time, where I'm reliving everything as if it's the current day. But what I found was that there were other keys into that experience. I'd actually written a very extensive, I think it ended up being like 300,000 or 400,000 words of a blog on my website. And I had my photographs, and I was able to I had photos and video, and I still had a relationship with all the people I'd met, so I was able to, for some parts, double check the names and spelling of people and all that type of factual stuff. And what I found, of course, was that to actually write properly, I needed to once I'd spent weeks preparing for a chapter, I'd start with a blank page, all the notes I'd taken from all that kind of stuff, I put it aside, and then just write. Because it's very important that you're not just learning rote and then repeating what you've written. You're writing a book. You're not just writing a diarised account of a travelogue. You're tying together so many different threads, historical threads and factual threads, feeling, personal. So, that's how I ended up writing the book. And obviously I remembered far too much. And the first draft of my book was probably 300,000 words or something like that.
Final version?
Final version, I think, was about 100, if I'm not mistaken, 170.
Wow. So you chopped it in half.
Something like that. Yeah.
Wow.
But it's still a big book,
No,
the average book's probably, 90,000, 70 to 90,000. Yeah. So I kind of, I intentionally kept that loss of the diaries to myself until the very end.
Right.
Because I was
Didn't want to spook the publishers.
worried that my editor might lose confidence in me, which I don't think he would have. But anyway, that was
totally it
was something I'm over it now. But it was very, very deeply deeply sad.
Oh, you could feel it as you could feel that through how you reported on that in those moments. It just sounded like the lowest depression, feeling of pointlessness.
Yes,
a different type of depression to grief. Just a feeling of failure. Kind of was what came through. So, it was maybe 3 years between the end of the journey and the book being published. Does it sound about right? Maybe a bit more?
No, a bit more than that. I think it would have been... I spent 2 years making the film series, the documentary series. And the book came out in 2013.
All right,
finished in 2000. So it's actually more like 5.
5.
5 years.
And
3 years of writing the book and 2 years of making the documentary.
But you'd received a bunch of awards, recognitions, maybe even medals, for exploration for journey. You won Australia's Explorer of the Year.
Adventure of the
Year. Yeah. So you're sort of starting to be swept up into some type of niche fame. Anyone who's interested in adventure in Australia would for sure have known you. But I'm curious to know how, and I edit it so you don't have to answer, and even to me you don't have to answer. Yeah. But how commercially successful was the book?
The book, a couple of things. I mean, if it's okay, I'd probably kind of backtrack a little bit. I couldn't find a publisher at that time in Australia that really had, I felt, understood or had the passion for the book as I saw it. When we discovered Anton Mueller and George Bloomsbury in New York, I knew that I had someone who kind of somehow just got it. He just really deeply understood it. And my feeling from the very beginning was that people in Europe, people in America even, just the nature of proximity, history, they probably would gravitate more to the story, to the cultural, historical context of it, than Australians, given that we're just so far removed from the Eurasian Steppe.
More broadly culturally, we are just more insular.
Yeah, well,
across many ways. Yeah.
By nature of geography, there's just no question that we're more insular. And so the book was to be first published in America, and secondly in the UK, thirdly in Germany, and lastly Australia. Things turned around, so in the end it was first published in Australia, then America, and so the tour kind of took me around the opposite way. But I remember finishing the book and having this moment, and I hadn't even contemplated this until what if people don't read it? It's an epic book. Yeah. Obviously we've moved on a lot since then, but even back then we'd already entered the world of Twitter and sound bites and
YouTube.
Yeah, YouTube and Instagram.
Definitely.
Was still kind of, that was the frontier of social media.
Nascent life.
It was. I had not even considered once whether people would read it or not. It just wasn't on my radar. All I knew is that I wanted to write this book, and I put as much passion in as I could. And my publishers, I think, also thought, well, look, this is a kind of an old style journey. It's fairly verbose, but look, it ended up starting off in Australia. It sold really well. I think it's probably sold in Australia about 50,000 plus hard copies of the book.
That's really commercially successful.
And probably 50 to 100,000 more in the US and Europe and UK and elsewhere. So it was amazing.
That's amazing.
That people and what's more.
So it justifies the publisher's investment and then some, big time.
What I hadn't expected was I guess the way that the stories resonated in Australia, and I think people were attracted to my personal story and the adventure story, and but also and probably got more than they bargained for because of the sheer volume of historical and socio-political content in the book as well. And vice versa. There were people who are probably armchair historians who found that it was much more personal and much more personal and evocative than a kind of hard history book. So not by design, but just the way it was. It did capture a wide audience, and I felt really, really, thinking back to when I was 14 and I dreamt of being an author. To me, that book was as big achievement as as travelling across the steppe itself, and it took just as long.
But well deserved. It really is. The writing, at least for me, obviously the journey and everything. But with the podcast, I end up reading a lot of books, and I find, whether it's just my own taste or whatever, but sometimes as you're going into it, you realize, this is going to be really good, because you just get this sense that the author is all over it from just the prose perspective. You're invited into this world. You're not just consuming information. You're living it out.
Thank you.
It really does the job.
I mean, it means a lot to me, because I don't forget for a single day what the effort that went into it, but mostly what the pride I guess I take into it is that I promised a lot of those people in those worlds that I would tell their story.
Right.
And so I did feel indebted to all these people who'd taken me in, and not only taken me and looked after me, but opened up about their personal stories and the story of their recent history. So to be able to capture that in a way that people found intriguing, I think for me is the real measure of achievement of the book.
But since you've gone back to Mongolia every year, more or less, have you noticed in the, say, 20 plus years since you first went there, the ubiquitousness of the phone and the motorbike? Are these further decaying the nomadic spirit and maybe what it is to be nomadic?
Look, I think it's a really good question. I think there's a broad concept, particularly in the West, that whenever the new world brushes up against the old, the inevitable loser is the old world. And whilst I think that is probably true in a lot of cases, I think the reality is a lot more interesting and complex than that. When I did the journey, certainly I think the biggest impact on the knowledge of the land, the plants, the skills of nomads has been from mechanical travel, so motorbikes and four-wheel drive. So these days, most nomads, their knowledge is in a smaller mapped area, because if they travel far, a lot of them will travel by motorbike or car. And since I did the journey, China has been producing these extremely economical bikes that you can buy for $200 or $300, and they've replaced the old heavy Russian planetas and things made in Ishevsk. So they've become more accessible to nomads. So definitely that has changed things. And look, I think it's interesting to go a little bit deeper into that and drill down, because there's a fantastic book called The Centaur Legacy by Bjarke Rink, and he talks about how the horse changed the course of human history. And I don't think that's an overstatement. It's once you read about it, I think it's very convincing. The huge impact that the relationship with horses has had on societies around the world. But anyway, he talks about how when we travel at a speed, I think about a greater than, say, 40 kilometres an hour, our brain can no longer really interpret things in detail. And so it just releases a bit of serotonin or whatever it might be to make us feel good, and we kind of glide across the landscape. But But on a horse, the vast majority of the time, even when you're going at a trot or a canter, sometimes a gallop, you're at a speed where the human brain can still interpret all the detail. And I mean all the detail. Every plant, every depression, every track, every little contour in that landscape. And what I found was that in the modern era, and I still find this, that beyond the kind of boundary of where they ride their horses, let's just say beyond where they graze their animals, if they were to drive their motorbike to town to do shopping, then their description of landscape changes dramatically. They no longer have that tactile ability to describe it in a nuanced ways that make sense to a horse rider. And so I found that all the time when I was riding my horse. If they were a horse rider who'd ridden that by horse, you could bet that their description would be very accurate. But, if it's a person who's only driven it routinely by bike, they'll say, turn left at the Red Mountain. When you see that hill, go around to the right. They could be talking in the scale of 50, 100 kilometres. Whilst on a horse, you're talking every 100 metres there's a feature to kind of follow. And so your map of the landscape shrinks in your mind as soon as mechanical transport is introduced.
It's such a lovely theory.
Yeah.
Because it proposes a lot of implications.
Oh, definitely.
And maybe explanations for a movement away from environmentalism and a proper feeling of the land that we're on and respect for it.
Modern cars, they're designed, there's engineers that spend a lifetime creating an insulation from the road noise, a sound quality within the car that allows you to completely transcend where you are.
Yeah.
Turn the music up, and off you drive, and you do get that serotonin release. And I think Bjarke Rink says something like lots of driving to the human mind is to the stomach, just eating colossal amounts of bland macaroni. It's not particularly healthy for the brain to be switching off, have this serotonin release. Anyway, so that's one way that is changing, and motorcycles have become more prominent. But more importantly, roads, as climate change has an effect in Mongolia, and on top of that, there are far too many goats because of the market prices of cashmere. Nomads used to have a very small quantity of goats in their herd because too many goats leads to unsustainable grazing. So you combine climate change, which means they're pushing further into remote areas to find pasture, which means more roads, which means more pressure on wildlife, more pressure on plant species. Those things are real and changing, and that's a real threat to not just nomadic culture, but just being able to live out there. Mongolia, like Australia, doesn't have a huge heap of topsoil to lose, and once you have a degradation of those grasslands through overgrazing, particularly with goats, you're never getting that soil back. Right. But back to your comment about smartphones, I think smartphones is a really interesting one that I've grappled with a lot. Back in 2000, when I first arrived by bicycle in Mongolia, I remember going past it was a newly opened mobile network office. There was a queue, hundreds and hundreds of metres down the street. Nomads, city people, young and old, all queuing up for a telephone. For a nomad, what could be more convenient than a mobile? Right. People who've been able to leapfrog copper wire. So arguably, mobile technology, be it mobile phones, be it batteries, little wind generators, solar panels, they've been able to adopt those without corrupting their way of life in many ways, because it's not changing their knowledge of the land around them. Having said that, during COVID, there was a investment across Mongolia, while I was not able to go, in these kind of micro mobile towers. And most of them are solar powered. They had, it was Herculean efforts to build them, usually local nomads ferrying with camels all the construction material needed, cement, steel, everything, to these really inaccessible mountaintops, no roads or anything. Anyway, they have set up these towers across the country, in most of the known summer grazing areas, winter grazing areas, autumn, spring. So those smartphones that nomads used to have, well, not smartphones, just the standard mobile, but they used to use like a CDMA network. That wasn't a digital network. Suddenly, and they'd only use them when they could drive or ride to somewhere that had reception. Now, in the last 2 years, they are carrying smartphones which are connected to 3G, 4G. And I'll just give you one small anecdote, which I think spells a change. In my journey, nomads always saw me coming long before I saw them. Like it was guaranteed.
Mm-hmm.
Like they know everything that moves. They're so present and aware of everything in their world. Anyway, I worked with a guy running expeditions now for probably 8, 9, 10, 11 years. And I love going there because they're always so present. And anyway, I come over a hill and I see him down lying next to the track with his horse, and I just think, what's he doing there? And he had his back turned to me, and I eventually got within, a few meters before he just suddenly, got a fright, turned around, and there I was there.
Mm.
And I realised then that he'd ridden up to that point because he got 4G there, and he was on his phone watching a serialised Mongolian TV program.
Yeah.
And I thought that's the first time in all those many years that I've known him that I've seen him long before he saw me.
Right. You've been able to sneak up on him.
And he was so glued to that he lost all perception of the world around him. And so in the last 2 years, that's been the biggest change I've seen in 20 years. Because they, suddenly we'll get to camp and instead of sitting around playing cards or just chatting or whatever, they'll be off to the nearest hillside that has 4G to all sit around watching a movie on a phone. So currency now are power banks.
Right. Man.
So that has changed things. I mean, look, it once that process begins, I mean, we're all human. So
yeah,
that's been the biggest change.
That's a really
it's a change in me.
fascinating anecdote.
When I did that journey, I had a satellite phone, but that's kind of ancient technology. I didn't have a smartphone. I didn't have Google Maps. I had an extremely basic GPS. Oftentimes you forget, looking back, that using the tools we have now, the trip looks very different than it would now. If you do it.
Pull it on Google Maps, do the walk.
Oh, there are so many resources.
Yeah.
So many resources out there. Yeah.
All right, well, Tim, can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time, inviting me into your home. Wonderful book. I projected a lot of adventure onto your story, and obviously this is 4 years in the making, so I really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, thanks for making the effort and finally persevering and getting here. Yeah.
No worries, mate.
Yeah.
Hello all and Merry Christmas. I just wanted to leave with this last part of the interview, which I had excised from the very beginning, just because it kind of naturally went there. But when I was editing it, later realized it definitely broke the flow of the interview. And it was Tim reflecting on how his own experiences, extensive experiences across both Ukraine and Russia, had evolved in light of the ongoing war there. Tim, of course, knows a lot of people who are now participating in the war effort for Ukraine, most specifically. I didn't hear him mention much about Russia, but he speaks very sympathetically about Russia and how much he loved the country and the shame about it changing. But anyway, I'll play it and you'll see it for yourself. And since it is Christmas and the end of the year, and the last you'll hear from me, especially in 2025, if you have the time, a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple would be greatly appreciated. And that's all from me. I'll see you next year. Here is Tim. How was your view on Russian culture evolved, especially since 2022?
Well, look, I've experienced Russian culture through the lens of the Finns, from that western side. Obviously, all of the trauma of the winter wars and Russia as a kind of imperialist threat to Finland. But I kind of sided with these beautiful people in Russia culturally. That northwest part of Russia, I felt kindness just spilled out of them.
Right.
When I travelled there previous to the bike ride and later, there was this one lady, Baba Galia, in the first 2 weeks of that cycling journey. She stopped us mid-track in the village. It was snowing, it was minus 15 or so, and she said, "You're not going any further until you have hot mushroom soup." We didn't need too much convincing, and we went. I defrosted, realised that I had this tingling in my toes, pulled my socks off. She looked down and screamed out, "You've got frostbite." Took me down to the clinic where we had this little surgical operation. I was looking, my Russian wasn't great then, I was looking through my English-Russian dictionary, and the doctor looked down and said, "Don't worry, this is not going to cost anything. But please bring me a kangaroo as a gift when you come back next time." Anyway, fortunately the frostbite wasn't too bad. He snipped off the flesh and we recovered, and we got to live for several weeks in this village with Baba Galia. And they treated us like their own kind of adopted grandchildren, and that has stuck with me forever since. And it made me realise too that for me, travel is all about that opportunity to step into the lives of other people, the environments of other people, and have that privilege to look out through their world, literally through the windows of their home, oftentimes. So to me, she represents all those early experiences in Russia, the flexibility, the way they talk, but
the open-heartedness.
That's right. And Siberia was another total different culture, more akin in some ways to Australia, whereas more like a colonised, a feeling of a colonised landscape, where the indigenous peoples of Siberia are in some parts more marginalised than other areas. There's a big difference between North Siberia and the South. So I started to become a little bit cynical about the Russian narrative that their model of colonisation of Siberia had been a lot more peaceful than the colonisation of by the Brits. Or
your discovery was that it was not peaceful.
No, not when you talk to indigenous people, not when you start to see the way that some Siberian people would treat indigenous Siberians with, I have to say, a similar tension to what you'd find in Australia. And so I've started to think there's a lot more to this story. I was travelling at all times across the steppe through nomadic societies that had all been colonised in one way or another by the Russian Empire and then by the Soviets. So I started to get a very different feeling of Russia from that southern edge. And it's a very, very long southern edge, many, many, many thousands of kilometres, and very multi-ethnic in its makeup. And I started to meet Russians, of course, who still live in that kind of frontier. And to me, a lot of those people were not really. I couldn't recognise those same Russian people I'd met in those early days. So I felt that Russia is just such a giant country. It's very complex.
Totally.
With so many hundreds of republics and so many different indigenous peoples. The homogenous kind of Russian notion that's exported doesn't really bear any sense of reality when you're on the ground. And so, look, by the time I reached southern Russia, where you've got people like Chechens, Kalmyks, Cossacks who suffered woefully during Stalin's industrialised campaign. And then you got even further to that, Crimean Tatars, who were probably in some ways most cruelly deported in 1944 to Siberia and Uzbekistan. They were kind of wiped off the map, literally. They were removed from the Encyclopedia of Soviet Peoples. There was an attempt to erase them from history and repopulate Crimea with Russians. And, of course, being in Sevastopol back then in 2006, just after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, it was a real eye-opener. They talk about Sevastopol, being a navy port, the port for the Black Sea Fleet. It was more Soviet than the Soviet Union. It was the last kind of hanger-on. And nowadays you could call it more Russian than Moscow. I mean, the sense of tradition and nationalism in Sevastopol, to me, was quite confronting, because the Orange Revolution had just passed. Yushchenko had come to power on the wave of that revolution, and I expected naively to arrive in Ukraine and congratulate the people who'd thrown out the Yanukovych and the old Russian Guard, only to find that, of course, in Crimea, the Russians were unbelievably hostile to the European-leaning powers that be. So, on the ground it was just so complex. And then as I got into Ukraine, I started hearing personal stories about Holodomor, the genocide, or be it organised or intended genocide.
The famine.
A famine that was either created through sheer incompetence or intentionally.
Right.
There's many different interpretations, but either way, I mean, the stories were just horrific.
Right. Boiling leather.
And the modern stories of Ukrainian culture being completely disregarded by Russians. I'd spent a lot of time with Russian families in Crimea and Sevastopol, and their modern day views on Crimean Tatars, on nomads, even Mongolians, Kazakhs, Cossacks. That's another whole story, a little bit different, but I started to find it hard to tread that line between the kind of imperialist Russian culture
to remain
the
open-hearted, non-judgmental traveller through a village.
It became harder and harder for me, and so I ended up spending a year in Ukraine. And at that time, things were still politically very unstable, and so whilst I still to this day absolutely love Russia and Russian culture, I mean, to me, there's absolutely there's no doubt as to who can stop the war at the moment.
Right.
And who the aggressor
is, who's at fault.
Yes. Yeah. I mean,
it's not the denazification of Ukraine.
Absolutely. I mean, it's there's obviously been some outrageous ways of justifying the invasion.
The special military operation.
But Ukraine has a long history with Russia, and a security pact for them with anyone is really crucial, just simply for survival of their culture, for no other reason. But like everywhere else, there's no simple answer. It's Ukraine itself is a very, very complex nation with a very complex history and also very multicultural, very, very multi-ethnic.
I was super surprised by just how multicultural they were. This is only one anecdote, so it doesn't tell a full story. But I was in Przemyśl, bad pronunciation, but it's a Polish border town with Ukraine. 4 days after they had invaded, and there was all this. There was just trains every 20 minutes coming through, full of women and children, a couple of drunk men, but then as well, surprisingly, thousands and thousands of Vietnamese people. So there's this whole Vietnamese contingent within Ukraine, and probably there's a huge Indian contingent there, and there's maybe a huge Bangladeshi contingent there. It's like maybe not Australia, but like there are people who are not either Ukrainian or Russian that live in that country.
Oh, it's a fascinating country. I mean, I remember spending quite a bit of time with an organisation in southern Russia. It might have been Kherson, where the government was incredibly proud of just how diverse their culture, their population was. There were books promoting ethnic diversity in Ukraine in a way that I hadn't seen as openly in Russia, not from government sources anyway. There's just so many friends of mine in Ukraine that have been affected by this war for no other reason than they are Ukrainian. And I think that Ukrainian culture to survive, Ukrainian language to survive, they need that sense of sovereignty. And it is a very rich culture that's still emerging from the shadow of Soviet times and Russian Empire times as well. So, look, it's a deeply traumatizing war that needn't have been, in my opinion.
You spent a year there, so presumably you have old friends there and people you had stayed with. Have you been able to speak with them?
Yeah, I speak regularly with my Ukrainian friends. I have one friend, actually the son of a priest in Western Ukraine.
Oh yeah, that priest was a mythical figure himself, wasn't he?
Yeah, Ivan. So his son was studying over at Yale, I think, in the US when the war started. He came home and he's actually been an interpreter for journalists on the front line. And now he actually crowdfunds for various battalions, especially those that come from his region of Western Ukraine. And the stories that he has from the front lines are they're just devastating, and it makes you realise that, to this day, the army is basically crowdfunded from a very grassroots level. His community will try to raise money just for bulletproof vests or scopes that they'll buy online from Sweden or elsewhere.
Yeah, or just like Land Cruisers.
Sorry?
Old cars, essentially.
Yes.
I remember there was a whole thing about people driving in all these old cars from Europe, dropping them off on the border and then it being driven to wherever to be repurposed as a vehicle for war.
Yeah, and these days, inventive ways of drone protection, drones themselves. But at a grassroots level, you have in the Carpathians, it's considered obviously a safe refuge, a lot of women and children living as refugees in those communities, spending a lot of their time making food, sewing, in the early days at least, camouflage nets, and it's an incredible effort, and a lot of local people, local entrepreneurs, they'll often use their own credit to buy something that's essential for their own army unit from their community, and then go to crowdfunding to try to cover the credit repayments.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's devastating.
Yeah.
Yeah.